Topic of today's presentation is springs. Now, before we go on, we know that there's water under the ground, and we know that groundwater is safer to drink than surface water, and that we usually dig wells to get at that water. But what if we did not even have to dig a well to get to that good water?
So what we have here is water coming up out of the ground. This is groundwater that is coming to the surface on its own, and you can see it flowing directly out of the ground there. Well, this is a natural occurrence. This is called a spring. A spring is where water comes up from the ground naturally. And springs are historically very, very important because the water was so clean. There is no animal living underground. There's no pollution deep underground, at least historically speaking. So the water that comes up out of the ground from a spring is clean water, which means you can drink it directly. You don't have to treat it. You don't have to worry about it making you sick and poisoning you. And you can kind of see that here about how clear this water is. It's not cloudy. There's nothing in it that's going to cause you any harm.
So how do springs form? Well, we know water has to get under the ground. We know the precipitation falls and it moves through the ground and becomes part of groundwater. But the ground is not necessarily uniform. Like you see right here, we've got a layer of rock that is different. Maybe that's a layer of rock that doesn't allow water through it very easily. So what we get is this kind of area where we get a collection of water just kind of hanging out. Well, the ground's not even. So the water kind of comes down here and it kind of collects up against that layer that's maybe not very permeable. And as more water falls, it kind of gets pushed down here to this low point. And if this process keeps happening, water gets pushed up out of the ground. That is what a spring is. It's a place where the water is getting pushed up out of the ground naturally. You can see it someplace like here. This is Death Valley. Doesn't rain very much, but over in these high mountains, it might rain or snow. And the water seeps into the ground, and then it comes over here and pops up out of the ground down here at the low point. That's what a spring is, and that's how they form. Now, how big are these springs?
Well, how big can springs be? Sometimes they can just be just a little trickle coming out of the ground.
Here's some examples of some really small springs that are really just a little bit of a trickle coming out of the ground.
But springs can be up to the size of a pond or a small lake, like this example you see here behind me.
Here's some examples of some rather large springs.
As you can see right out there, see that place where it looks like the water is bubbling up? That's called the spring boil. That's where the water is actually physically coming up out of the ground and bubbling up and filling up this little pool, which is the natural spring.
Now, why were these springs so historically valued? Well, we talk about this with water, that water on the surface is not safe to drink. You got a cow that or other animals that poop in it, you've got runoff, you've got pollution. So surface water historically was not safe to drink. Even going back to historic times, people knew that surface water could make you sick.
Now remember that spring water is clean water, it's not contaminated, so you can drink it coming straight out of the ground. And here at Lithia Springs Park, they have these water fountains that are connected directly to that spring because it's clean water. Press the button, and you can drink the water directly, and it has a little bit of a taste to it. It doesn't taste like tap water, because the one thing that's true about spring water is generally it has a little bit more minerals in it, so it gives it a little bit of taste. But this water is safe to drink because it's coming straight out of the ground before it got contaminated.
And you'll see that a lot of natural springs, especially in older places, have been built up like water fountains because Even in ancient times, people knew that, hey, this is good water. I want to collect it. I want to drink from it. I want to draw from it. So, especially in older establishments where before modern plumbing, you will see springs end up looking like this. The town of Cedartown in West Georgia. There was a big, huge spring in that area, and they actually built their town's water plant right on top of the spring where they take the water straight up out of the ground, run it through pipes to everybody's house. So when they turn on their tap water, what they're getting is direct spring water straight from the spring, which is okay because spring water is clean water.
Now, because spring water is clean water and you can drink it without it being treated, homes in this area actually get their water directly from this spring. You can see these pipes that go underground and catch that spring water before it gets to the surface and before it can get contaminated, and can pipe this directly into the homes in the area for good, clean water.
Now, one thing about catching that spring water, this is that same spring. You've got to protect the spring because you don't want stuff getting down there into the spring. So I want to show you what they did here to protect the spring source, because this is where the people in this area get their drinking water. So there's the cave under the ground where the water is coming up out of the ground, and you can see they put a protective gate on it. That way nobody can get down in there, or no pollution can get down in there and contaminate their drinking water, because it's not being cleaned before it goes straight to their houses. Now, where are springs found? They are not rare. They are found in all 50 states. And they can form anywhere where there's a place for groundwater to come to the surface. And every place has groundwater, even in the middle of the desert. So you're going to find springs everywhere. Do we have them in Georgia? Yes. There are approximately 208 named springs in Georgia. When I say named springs, that means they were big enough or significant enough for somebody to look at it and say, hey, this is a special source of water. I'm going to call it something. Now, there's a bunch of towns that sprung up around these springs because people wanted to live someplace where they could get good, clean drinking water. You'll recognize some of these names. The city of McDonough in south of the airport was formed in 1823 as people were moving away from the coast where the original colony was in Georgia, and they're moving inland and say, hey, we got to find some water. That's where we need to live, is where we have some water. And they came across this big spring and said, let's settle here. And that was very, very common for a lot of very early, say, frontier style towns back in history, that you settled where you could get water. Where could you get water easily? From the spring that's bringing it to the surface for you. You might recognize the name of Sandy Springs, Georgia, which you might not know was or is that there actually is an actual Sandy Spring.
So let's talk about a very notable spring in our area, and one that I'm sure you will recognize the name of. Back here, underneath this little grating here, there is water coming up out of the ground naturally. That's a spring. This particular one is called Sandy Spring. Hence the name of the town in our area, North Fulton, called Sandy Springs. People moved to this area and they settled here because they had this spring coming up out of the ground and some nice sandier soil, which made the water not as muddy, so a little bit easier to drink. Well, think about the area of Sandy Springs. This area, people came here and they lived here because they had this nice, good, clean, reliable source of drinking water. They had the Sandy Spring, which gave them good water. Now, we're going to go over here and take a look at it, and the spring isn't so impressive anymore. So here is the Sandy Spring, from which the town of Sandy Springs got its name. And people came here and settled in this area because they had this spring here, which was a good, reliable source of clean water. Now, it doesn't look like much, and it isn't now. The question is, what has changed with this spring? Remember, a spring is where water comes up out of the ground naturally. How did water get into the ground in the first place? Well, it had to infiltrate from rain, precipitation. It doesn't rain any less now than it did 200 years ago. But what's different about this area is now that it's all parking lots and roads and buildings and houses. And that means there's so little area for water to get into the ground that it means there is so much less water to then come out of the ground. So springs can run dry. They can actually even die if their water supply is cut down. Now consider where I'm at now. I'm standing at North Springs High School, which if you've heard of this high school, you know where it's at. It's in the town of Sandy Springs, very close to where we are in Roswell. But let's stop and talk about, well, why is this high school called North Springs? It's because there used to be a spring in this area, and it is a little bit north of the Sandy Springs. So this area was called North Springs because there was a spring here of note. Now, that spring is long since dried up and gone. It's been covered up by roads and parking lots and buildings and such. But this area historically was called North Springs because there was a spring here north of the Sandy Springs, and hence the name of the high school became North Springs for the spring that used to be here. So here I am in the town of Cave Spring, Georgia. As you can imagine, the town got its name because it is a place where there is a spring, water coming up naturally out of the ground, but it comes out of the ground inside of a cave, which makes it a little bit unique. Now the cave is back here. They've actually built a little fort around the cave to help protect it because this is how the town got their drinking water, and they didn't want anybody to get into the source of their drinking water and pollute it. Any animals, any people, any pollution. You can still see behind me that pipe back there. That's where they take the spring water and they run it into every house in town. That's what they drink. That's what comes out of their faucet. Now they've left this right here, a place where the spring empties out of the cave, and you can come here and you can collect all the spring water you want. There's a container back there which I've collected for us to use in class. Every time I've been here, I've seen multiple people with large amounts of containers just collecting the spring water to take home and drink. Why not? It's free. As opposed to having to go to the grocery store and buy spring water, you can come here and you can get it for free. Some people like the taste of this particular spring water so much that they come from all over to collect it and bring it home. As a matter of fact, people collect so much spring water that right here outside the cave you can see there's a couple wheelbarrows and there's a hand truck that people can use to move the large amounts of water that they will collect here and take home. I just talked to a lady who was from Stone Mountain, Georgia, and we're about almost 2 hours away from Stone Mountain, Georgia here, and she had one of these wheelbarrows just full of these big, large 5-gallon water containers to take home to her house. She swears by this water, says there's nothing else that she would rather drink. So once again, this is Cave Spring, Georgia, where we have a cave that has a spring inside of it that is giving the town its spring water. So let's take a look at a significant use of a spring. Back there is Bulware Spring, where water is coming up out of the ground naturally. I'm just south of the town of Gainesville, Florida. And what they did was they built this holding pen and they built a pump house where they collected that nice clean groundwater and they sent it through a pipe and pumped it into the city of Gainesville so everybody had good clean drinking water. This spring is the reason why the University of Florida is located in Gainesville. In the early 1900s, the state was looking to build a new university. Of course, they needed clean water. They needed it for dorms, for drinking, for bathing. And the city of Gainesville said, hey, come here, build the University of Florida in Gainesville because we've got this facility that will provide all of the clean, safe water that you'll need for your university.
Now, the state of Florida has the largest concentration of springs on the planet. Springs are found everywhere in all 50 states, but Florida has the most by far. There's about 8 billion gallons of water that come out of the springs in Florida every single day. Some of the biggest ones are putting out 45,000 gallons of water every minute. The question we want to answer is why, and this is a multi-step explanation. Well, the first reason is all about precipitation. You got to have water going into the ground in order to make groundwater. You got to have precipitation. And we know that this area of the country gets more precipitation than anywhere else. So reason number one, we get lots of rain. And we know why we get lots of rain. Remember, we have those constant sea breezes that bring water in, nice wet water in off the ocean, hits the land, it goes up, makes clouds, makes rain. Florida has those sea breezes that help to produce all of that rain that they get. Now, the second reason is the shape of the land. Florida is notoriously flat. So all the water that falls out of the sky just sits there on the ground and is able to go into the ground as opposed to sliding off into a river, which then maybe goes to the ocean. Think about it this way. If we have rain that falls onto the top of the steep land, some will go into the ground, but because the land is steep, a lot more water is going to slide off, become runoff. If the ground is flat and the water is just sitting here, it can't help but go into the ground. So you're going to have more groundwater. More groundwater means more springs. The third reason is, what is the ground like in Florida? We know it's made of sand and it has limestone underneath it. So water goes into the ground easily, which adds to the groundwater. We know the rock down there is limestone, which, if you remember from our lab experiment, limestone holds a fair amount of water. So those are the three reasons why Florida has by far more springs than any other location on the planet. Let's look at some examples of some Florida springs. Here's Juniper Spring. Notice how crystal clear the water is. This is Ponce de Leon Spring. Ponce de Leon was a Spanish explorer who was tooling around Florida in the early days of exploration, and he was looking for the famous fountain of youth, that source of water that would keep you alive forever, keep you young. And when he found this particular spring, he thought maybe it was that proverbial fountain of youth, and now it is named in his honor. It's Rainbow Springs, Poe Springs. And once again, you can kind of see out there in the middle, that's the cave where the water is coming up out of the ground and then spreading out and making the spring pool. Now, these springs were actually a huge tourist draw in Florida, especially in the days before the mouse or Disney. So imagine you're 100 years ago and big public swimming pools really weren't a thing because we didn't have the water capacity or the plumbing to be able to fund and have big public swimming pools. But if you went to Florida, you had these crystal clear springs that were really, really large. When you see the size of that, the size of a lake, well, people went there and they went swimming in the clean spring water as opposed to going into, even the ocean or into a muddy lake or a river, especially where there's maybe some other creatures and such. So these springs in Florida were turned into huge tourist attractions. And you can see here's an early postcard of what they did in Silver Springs, which is near Ocala, Florida. Weeki Wachee is a very famous pre-Disney Florida attraction. It was huge before the 1960s and Disney opened. And it is a big, huge natural spring, one of the largest in Florida. You can see it over here. The water is coming up out of the ground from a really huge, deep cave, and it kind of flows this way. And they built a theater. They cut into the side of the spring, and they had these big curtains, and they would open the curtains, and it was like you're looking at a movie screen. And then they had performers there. They had girls dressed in mermaid type outfits, and they had little air hoses, scuba kind of hoses, and they would dance around to the music that was piped in. It was a live show, but it was really unique because it was underwater. It was a true mermaid show. You couldn't do this in a lake because a lake, the water would be too muddy and too cloudy. But here in Weeki Wachee Spring in Florida, this was a really huge attraction. It is still going today, although it's not nearly as big an attraction as it was 50, 100 years ago.
So only a few generations ago, things like swimming pools really weren't that common because you didn't have access to good, clean public water. Well, if you were in the state of Florida, like I am here, and you had a spring coming up out of the ground bringing you clean water all the time, you could build yourself a wall, trap the water, and make yourself what's called a spring-fed swimming pool. And that's what we have here. This is at a little hotel in the town of Crystal River in Florida. And this was huge for the tourism industry in Florida because you could come to Florida and you could swim in a swimming pool as opposed to in the lake or in the rivers or in the oceans. And you could swim in the swimming pool year round because the water coming out of the ground is 72 degrees in January and in July. So this can be used year round. This is one of the last examples of a spring-fed swimming pool left in the state of Florida. Obviously, we don't need them as much today as we did a few generations ago because we have more access to clean water and things like chlorine and chemicals that help keep our swimming pools clean and usable year-round.
One thing you can see in the springs, especially in the Florida time, in the wintertime in Florida, are manatees. Manatees, also called sea cows, they're mammals and they are warm-blooded, so they like a little bit warmer temperatures. And in the wintertime, when the Gulf of Mexico gets a little bit cooler, the manatees actually come into the state of Florida. They swim upriver and they go hang out in these springs because the springs, remember, stay the same temperature year round. They're not dependent on the sunlight because the water coming out of the ground has the same temperature, which is a little bit warmer than the Gulf of Mexico in the wintertime. So you can go to Homosassa Springs and they have a viewing area where you can go underneath the water level and they open a big window and you can see the manatees swimming around. Now this is Three Sisters Spring, and you see how clear the water is. This was at spring break, so a little late. Most of the manatees had already gone back out to the Gulf because it was getting warm enough. But in the wintertime, if you go here, it is wall-to-wall manatees. You can almost walk across this spring on the backs of manatees. And here's a guy that just had not left yet. He was a little late to leave. But in the wintertime, you go to the springs and it's wall-to-wall manatees. And one of the few places you can go and you can observe those manatees so clearly. This is Devil's Den. This was a spring that now has a lower water level. You can see the opening. The water used to come out there, but the water table has gone down here since the last ice age. So now basically we've got a big cave with an opening in the top of it, but it's still a spring because you got water coming up to the surface. Florida doesn't have hasn't cornered the market on springs. There are springs everywhere. In Austin, Texas, they have Barton Springs. And you'll notice what they did. They made it into a big, huge public swimming pool. It's been this way for well over 100 years. And they don't have to clean this. There's no chlorine or treatment to this. Water is coming up out of the middle. And as this pool fills up, it basically runs off the end and more water is coming up. So you get a constant supply of clean water at about 72 degrees year round. Now, to summarize, why would these springs be turned into huge tourist attractions? What's the draw? Well, first of all, it's like a free natural swimming pool. You get all the clean water you want. You don't have to do anything to it. No chemicals. And the temperature is constant year round. So you can swim in them year round, which is very different than a traditional swimming pool, which will get cold because it is just sitting out in the sun and its temperature is dependent on whatever the air temperature is. Now, let's compare it to Florida to Georgia. We do have springs here in Georgia, but not nearly as much as we have in Florida. And let's look at why. It's not so much the difference in precipitation because it still rains a lot here in Georgia. We get a lot of rain, but because we're fairly mountainous, we have a lot of hills. A good portion of our rain ends up becoming runoff. It goes into a river and goes downhill, goes somewhere else, which means it doesn't have time to infiltrate into the ground. Less groundwater means fewer springs. The second reason is we got clay. So remember, when water falls as precipitation hits on clay, it doesn't like to go into the ground that easily. It takes a long time. So instead, the water is going to slide off before it can infiltrate the ground. In addition, here in our area, we've got granite underneath us. And remember, granite doesn't have enough space to hold a lot of water. Well, the less water you have under the ground, the fewer springs you're going to have. Now let's talk about this idea of spring water that we go and we get from the grocery store.
So let's take a look at this bottle here. You'll notice it is labeled spring water. Well, what does that mean? Well, that means that the water that is in this bottle must have come out of the ground naturally from a spring, which is what a spring is. It's a place where water comes out of the ground naturally. If you sell what's called spring water, if you have spring water on the label, on the back, you basically have to be able to prove that it came out of the ground naturally. You can see the ingredients say spring water. You can also see that down here it has a source listed. It says Silver Springs in Silver Springs, Florida. By law, if you sell spring water, you gotta say where it came from. You basically have to prove that it came out of the ground naturally.
Now, the spring water brand Poland Spring, you might or might not have seen this, but it's a brand of spring water that comes out of the state of Maine. And they're being sued right now because it is alleged that they are not getting their spring water from the spring that they say they're getting it from, or they're adding municipal water. And that when you buy that bottle that is labeled spring water, you're not getting 100% pure spring water. I'm not sure the status of this lawsuit right now, but this is a serious issue. If you're going to label something spring water, you got to say it came from this spring, not this one over here. And it must all be from that spring. So what's purified water? Well, purified water is just H2O that could have come from anywhere. Could have come from a well. It could come from the tap. It could come from a river. It could come from a lake. Could be from a melted glacier. It could be anything. Purified water is just water that's basically been cleaned and is now safe to drink, which you don't have to do with spring water because we know if it says spring water, it's safe to drink. So what about Dasani?
So let's examine Dasani and talk about what it means to be Dasani water. Now, Dasani is not labeled with spring water. It says purified water. Well, the fact that it doesn't say spring water on the label means Dasani was not sourced directly from the ground. It's not from a natural spring, otherwise, it would be labeled as such. Well, we flip it over and we also see in the back there is no source listed. Because remember, if you call something spring water, you have to actually denote, you have to designate what natural spring it came out of. Dasani is not spring water, so therefore it doesn't have to have a source listed. So that begs the question, what is Dasani? Well, it is what's called purified water. Purified water is just H2O. They put purified on the label just to let you know that, hey, it's been cleaned, it's been treated, it's safe to drink. But where this water came from is unknown. And it could come from anywhere. It could come from a river, a lake. It could come from the ground, although unlikely. In the case of Dasani here in our area, it comes from the Chattahoochee River. It's the same water that runs through our taps here in Roswell. So the fact that it's purified water means there's really nothing special about it. Dasani in California can come from a water company in California. Dasani in New York comes from a water company in New York. It is not spring water. It does not come from the ground naturally.
So why are there so many different brands of spring water? If you go to the grocery store, you'll see many, many, many different types. Well, think about spring water. It has to come from a spring, and there are lots of different springs. And each spring must be its own brand of spring water. So this is why we get multiple brands of spring water. Now, people in California, they get their spring water from a spring out there. And we don't sell that spring water here in Georgia. Why would we? We have our own springs. And people in Pennsylvania, they have their own springs. So they have their own spring water with a different name. And we're not going to buy spring water from other parts of the country because it's just easier to get it from our springs here. Now, if you're in California and you go to the QT and you go to buy some bottled water, you might find this. This is Arrowhead. and it says it is spring water, and you flip the bottle over and you can actually see what I was just talking about. The source: Riverside County, California, San Bernardino, California, Canyon Springs in San Bernardino County, Coyote Springs, Inyo County. So people in California buy spring water from the springs that they have there. Now, you probably never heard about these two brands. These were two brands of spring water that I got when I was overseas. I was in England. And in England, they have springs. So they drink their spring water, and it is called the name that they give to that particular spring. They're not going to drink the spring water from California because they have their own springs to bottle and sell. So let's talk about Fiji. Fiji is this really expensive, fancy kind of spring water. But why? Well, the reason is it comes from the island of Fiji, which is way out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. There's a spring there, and you collect the water and you bottle it. But to get it to us, you got to put it on a ship, send it through the Panama Canal, take it to some port on the East Coast, transfer it to a truck, and ship it to our grocery stores. That's what makes Fiji water so expensive, is because it comes from someplace far away. And that's the number one reason why one spring water is typically more expensive than another. It's not the quality of the water, it's typically just how far away did it come from. Now, why would you do this? Why would you drink Fiji? Well, some people like the particular taste of Fiji water. Remember, different spring waters come from different ground, so they're going to have slightly different taste. And Fiji is a water that people are willing to pay that extra money for that very specific taste. Now, this water here comes all the way from Iceland. Same thing. It's going to be a little bit more expensive because Iceland is not close by. We have to collect that water in Iceland, and we have to send it here. Now, Iceland has a huge amount of spring water. As a matter of fact, people's tap water in Iceland is almost exclusively well or spring water. And the reason is it rains and snows a lot because of that Gulf Stream, and they have this really porous rock that allows water to go in the ground very easily, and it can also get pushed back up very easily. So people in Iceland have this little joke. I found this water bottle in the airport, how to drink bottled water in Iceland. You take your bottle and you fill it up at the sink, and that's what they have, is spring water coming out of their taps. But Icelandic water is going to be like Fiji water. It's going to be a little bit more expensive. And this Volvic water, I can't remember exactly where it comes from, but I know it's not local. It's not from the U.S. Notice the prices of these three water bottles. Yet Deer Park, you can get a lot more water for half the cost. Well, why is that? Well, it's because Deer Park water comes from Florida. Florida's right next door. It's a lot cheaper to get water from Florida and bring it here than it is to get water from Iceland or Fiji. Now, an interesting story behind Deer Park, for those of you that like or don't like Deer Park water. Deer Park was a spring that was in Pennsylvania or Maryland. I don't remember which one. And I used to drink it in college, and I enjoyed it. I went to college in Pennsylvania. I enjoyed Deer Park water. And in the 90s, when bottled water started to take off, and big companies like Coke and Nestle wanted their own spring water brands, Nestle bought the Deer Park spring, and they started selling Deer Park water. But then they got to the point where they couldn't get enough water from that spring to meet the demand. So they had to go look for another spring somewhere that could give them more water. And they actually bought springs in Florida. And so when we buy Deer Park water now at QT or the grocery store, it's got spring water from Florida in it. I don't particularly care for the taste of the spring that it's coming from in Florida. I liked the taste of the spring water in Pennsylvania. I used to enjoy Deer Park water, but now it's a different spring. It tastes different. Next summer when I go to Pennsylvania, or when I go to the Northeast, I'm going to try to find me some Deer Park water because I want to see if up there, do they still use the original spring? And if so, can I taste the difference? Now, I've been talking about these minerals in the spring water the whole time. Let's examine this a little more carefully.
So here we've got a spring, a place where water is coming out of the ground naturally. When the water comes up out of the ground, it will bring some of the ground with it, or little pieces of minerals from the ground. And when that water gets on the surface, it will drop those minerals and you can actually see them. And that's why we see this orange color here. These are minerals that are being brought up from under the ground by the water that then get dropped here. So this is Lithia Springs, just outside of Tampa, Florida, and it gets its name from the element lithium. Story was, back in the 1800s when the first settler bought this land with a spring on it, he noticed that the water had a very particular taste to it. Sent it off for testing, and it was determined that this water had an abnormally high amount of the element lithium in it, hence became the name of Lithia Springs. This spring is named after the minerals in the water, which gave it a very distinct taste.
So, point I'm trying to make here is that different spring waters have different taste because they come from different springs, which have different grounds, which have different minerals. The mineral content of spring water is going to be listed on the bottle because just like any other food that is sold and marketed to people, you got to be able to tell people what's in it. And so it might not always be on every individual bottle, but you can find this out what minerals are in spring water. Here's the same brand, Proud Source, and I noticed that these are both in my local Publix, but they got one that's bottled in Florida and one that's bottled in Idaho. And you'll notice it has a different pH because the different ground is going to give you different minerals. And they actually have a different mineral content. Calcium in this one is 42, calcium in that one is 51. Now, mineral springs. A mineral spring is a spring where the water has enough minerals in it. It's got a lot of minerals in it, so that it significantly alters the taste. And mineral water is water that tastes different due to the high content of minerals. Perrier and this other brand here will have the word mineral water written right on the label. And that tells you that it's not just spring water, it has a significant amount of minerals, and you're going to taste the difference. This here is a spring, and it doesn't look very pretty, does it? This over here is actually rust because this water, as it comes up out of the ground, it has a lot of iron in it. And when the iron comes to the surface and gets dropped, just like any iron that's left outside, it is going to rust. So if you drank this water, you would taste a lot of iron. This is actually a spring where you wouldn't want to drink the water. It won't harm you, but it would be like licking a rusty nail, and it would not taste good. Lithia Springs, this time in Colorado, same thing, had a high amount of the element lithium in it. And lithium was thought to have curative properties, so the guy that owned this actually bottled this and sold this as like a medicine. Now, some springs can come up out of the ground with carbonation in them. We think about carbonation being added to water. You've had carbonated water, but there are some springs, especially in this area, in the Soda Springs area of Idaho, where the carbonation is natural. Here you can see it. The water is coming up out of the ground carbonated. It's a fizzy spring water because it has natural carbonation in it. You have a lot of springs around there called Soda Spring. It was fizzy. Imagine it was your way of getting a carbonated drink before we had CO2 to add like we take for granted today. Now, sometimes you get stuff coming up out of the ground that you don't want, like sulfur. Sulfur is a mineral, doesn't smell good. It smells like rotten eggs. So this spring water here smells pretty bad, but it doesn't hurt you. You can drink it. My son did not like the taste and or the smell of the water fountain that came from this spring. Now, is spring water good for you? Here's a drinking spring outside of Glenwood Springs, Colorado, and people used to come there and take cocktails of mineral water. And the thought was that this was going to cure some ailments, and it was marketed that way. Manitou Springs, Colorado has dozens of springs, and each one has slightly different mineral content. People would come there and drink the waters to help make them feel better, and that's what it was marketed as. Hey, come drink the mineral water, and it has curative properties, going to make you feel better. And the town of Manitou Springs actually has this chart where you can look and you can see the different mineral content of each individual spring, and different ones were thought to have curative properties for different things.
So here's a sample of the water that I brought back from Manitou Springs in Colorado this summer. The water's been sitting now a couple months in this container, and now you can see at the bottom there appears to be little crystals of stuff down there. And what those are minerals that were in the water that have now settled to the bottom because the water isn't moving as much as when it came out of the spring. So this is an example of how you can see the minerals that are in the spring water.
This was a spring in Normandy over in Europe. And once again, this mineral water here was thought to have curative properties for uh, problems with the eyes. Don't know how the story got started, but it was pitched that way that, hey, this is a special type of spring water. It's got just the right kind of minerals in it that will help with problems of the eyes. So let's answer that question. Is spring water good for you? This takes a little bit of background here. You've got to remember, in this day and time when these springs were first being used, we didn't have reliable water, we didn't have good diets, people would have mineral deficiencies in their diet. You didn't eat all your vegetables, you didn't have access to them, you didn't take your one-a-day vitamins, so you could have health afflictions that were due to mineral deficiencies. Well, if you drank a spring water that had some of those minerals in there, yes, it could make you feel better, or it could actually cure some of your problems. Because to this day, there are a lot of things that we take, especially medicines for our digestive tract, that are strictly mineral based. So if you drank the right mineral water, yes, it could make you feel better. It was also true that the minerals in the water would tend to cure up things like skin conditions. When the days when we didn't take baths every day and didn't necessarily have all the great soaps, the minerals would help clear up things that you had wrong with your skin. And think about this. You do mineral wraps when you go to the spa, or at least you've heard of that, and it makes your skin better. So to answer this question, spring water is good for you, but we don't necessarily drink it or use it now today specifically for medicinal purposes.